Hello everyone, thank you for being here. We're going to get started pretty shortly, but to begin I wanted to make sure to explain our Q&A process. So you will have seen some index cards at the front. With your questions you'll be able to write them down over the course of the event, hold them up, we'll run around and grab them and collect them and have them all ready to go for the Q&A. If you don't have a pen, we also have a few pens we can give you. Make sure to write your name and contact info on that as well, because that way, if we aren't able to get to your question in the time of our Q&A, we can come back and answer it later. We always want to make sure all the questions get answered, even if we're not able to get to it during the event. Again, we're going to start momentarily. If anybody doesn't have an index card, needs a pen, etc., raise a hand, we'll run around and grab them for you. But yeah, thank you so much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Very happy to see you all here, and very happy to be here on the Metro Ed site. And we appreciate so much the administration here accommodating us to do this. Over the years, both Assemblymember Kalra and I have had the opportunity to partner with Metro Ed on any number of things, and it's always been such a great partnership, so we appreciate being out here. This event, this town hall, was really triggered, if you want to use that word, by something called the Silicon Valley Pain Index. I imagine some of you are familiar with that. I see some heads nodding. If you aren't, that's okay. You're not going to be lost. In fact, just the opposite. I think you're going to get more information about that today and really a better understanding as to some of the things that it does. Professor Scott Meyers-Lipton, who's sitting here to my right, is really, this Silicon Valley Pain Index is really his brainchild, and I say that in the most respectful way because it's become, of all the different reports that we get from various organizations, I won't name them, but from various organizations around the health of our community, the health of our economy, the disparities between income and poverty here, and all those kinds of things that we're aware of and we feel, we sense, and when we go to the store to purchase something, we feel it in our pocketbooks. All of that has, in a sense, been indexed by the Silicon Valley Pain Index in a way that's so useful and so user-friendly that to me it just overshadows, frankly, every other report that comes out of Silicon Valley that attempts to deal with the health of our community. So we love it. I want to speak for Senator Kalra, but I know he's here today co-sponsoring this event, this town hall, with my office because we find it compelling and we find it goes to the heart of the kind of work that we're trying to do, justice work. He and I have a tendency to support each other's legislation in Sacramento because of that. There's a common denominator around justice, and it's really hard not to support some of these bills when you see that they're coming from a place of trying to bring equity to our community and justice to our community and lift up people who are downtrodden, frankly, by a number of things, including just the basic cost of living, especially in this area, right? In this particular area, leading the nation in youth homelessness is not something that we should be proud of, and leading in the number of billionaires and millionaires at exactly the same time. That's not who we should be. I want to thank our panelists for their work in contributing to today's discussion. We'll hear from each and every one of them. It's a great panel. I think we did a good job, and our staffs did a good job of bringing folks together here. I was half joking, but mostly serious when I was walking down, greeting them a few minutes ago, indicating that we're going to hear some real opinions today because these are folks who have been in the trenches and they don't pull punches. They say, they speak truth to power, they say what needs to be said, and I think this will be a lively conversation because of that, and a useful one, a productive one. So again, Superintendent Alyssa Lynch, thank you so much for having us here. You've done such a nice job now. We'll probably come back again and again, so be warned about that. The Q&A format, there's index cards. So you want to put your question as you think of it, as you're listening to the panel, or it could be a comment, put that down and raise your hand. There are folks here on staff who are going to be coming around like Zach and others grabbing those cards. The purpose of that is in part because we can consolidate some questions from time to time. Sometimes we'll get 2 or 3 questions that are identical or close to the same, and we can deal with all that much more easily that way. We're going to have the Q&A at the end, and I think we've allocated more than a half hour for that. So if the panelists can be brief and treat that as kind of a lightning round so we can get through that Q&A letter later on. That would be great, because I know one of the more frustrating things in a town hall is to have a burning question or thought on your mind, and then the town hall concludes and your card didn't get called upon. So we're gonna do our best. If you put your, if you want to, this is totally voluntary, if you put a contact, like, doesn't have to be a text number, it can be an email address on that card. What I guarantee you is, and this is really a guarantee, that if that question didn't get fully answered, we will know that. And you will get an answer back from one or both of our offices. You will get a response back, and you'll hear back from the Senate office or the Assembly office. Sometimes we get a question that no one knows the answer to exactly, or requires more detail. With that, I want to turn it over to my good friend and colleague, and someone who I admire greatly, Assemblymember Ash Kalra.
Thank you so much, Senator Cortese. Senator and I are he's definitely a partner in justice in so many different ways. Over the last couple of years, over many years, but the last couple of years in particular, we were both sharing our respective labor committees, the Senate side, the Assembly side, and definitely a lot of what we bring to the legislature is kind of how we've approached our work over many, many years. And it's informed by so many of you on the panel, in the room, in our community, it's really important for all of us. And by the way, when we're done speaking, I think we're gonna shift to that side, because I also wanna watch and listen, because this is just as much for us to learn and absorb as it is for everyone in the audience. And by the way, a great turnout for one of the most beautiful Saturdays we've had yet this year. I also want to thank Superintendent Lynch and Metro Ed for giving us this beautiful space. This is already such an important educational facility for our region, and it's great to be a community meeting space to have these important conversations as well. And Professor Meyers-Lipton, as Dave said, has been at the forefront of this work of identifying the tension and the struggles and frankly the pain that has been long existing in terms of our economic system in the Valley, but to be able to identify it, to name it, to put real numbers to it, and to put real faces to it, that allows the opportunity to find real solutions. And so that's why I think it's so important, because as Dave said, and I might put some names to it, when you have the Bay Area Council, the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, or Silicon Valley Business Journal do, hey, let's do an economic summit. What is the state of the Valley, the state of California this year? It comes from one angle. We oftentimes say we live in a tale of two valleys, a tale of two cities, where we're the wealthiest region, the wealthiest state, the wealthiest country on earth. And yet we have homeless, yet we have seniors and young people who are homeless. We have people living 2-3 families in a home. We have small businesses that don't get the attention or the support as the large corporations do. And so when you have these other entities that are looking at the economics of the Valley, they're looking at, okay, well, how are our numbers? How are our stocks doing? You know, how's real estate values? You know, what is our bottom line? And the flip side of that is the struggles that actual families are going through, individuals are going through, small businesses are going through, the struggles of the unhoused, the struggles of young people who are finding it harder and harder to survive in the place that they call home. We have more seniors entering homelessness than we've ever had in the history of our country. It's unconscionable, it's immoral, but the question is, what do we do about it? And you know, part of the aspect of it being racial justice and poverty is that there's an absolute racial, like if you look at the data, there's very much a connection, but you don't necessarily even have to look at the data to understand that the economic systems that we have make it a lot harder for some members of our community, and we need to identify it, name it, and then figure out what to do in terms of policy to heal and frankly to share the wealth. You know, there's no reason why wealth should be hoarded in the way that it is amongst the very, very few wealthy. And that's really what we see happening in our economic system. I think if I asked probably most of you here, you'd probably say it feels like it's getting tougher and tougher to live here. Even if your paycheck may have gone up some, it's not keeping up. And so when we talk about the pain index, it's real pain by real families. The numbers are important, but ultimately underlying it are real people, real families. And it's important for us to be able to have data so that when Dave and I say, hey, we have legislation we want to do, or a budget ask, or we want to work with other electeds or community leaders or organizations on this, it's important to have those numbers, but we can't forget that behind those numbers is real suffering, and families that are trying to do the same thing that every other family is trying to do, which is take care of their loved ones, take care of their children, of their parents. I have my dad here with me today, who has seen, just like I have being here, kind of this transformation of the valley. But we've also seen an increase in those who are struggling and want to be part of the solution there. So I'm very grateful to all of you for being here, for showing up, and very grateful to Senator Cortese and his team in partnering in making this happen. Because again, this is a conversation that we can have once a year when the pain index is released, but the reality is the value of it is what we do the rest of the year to actually give actions and power to what we might hear today and what the index says in words. So thank you for being here today, and I'm hopeful and I'm hoping that you'll all be part of this journey towards solutions as well. Thank you.
We just say, in terms of action, we have something in Sacramento that and sometimes we travel and do this, but we call it an informational hearing. And we've both have participated in those very often. The idea with that is exactly what the Assemblymember was just talking about. If we hear ideas that need to be pursued in Sacramento from this, think of it as a town hall, but also think of it as a hearing, because we're here and we are fully entitled, of course, to take what we hear today and convert it into legislative work, and that's already happened. Both of us, each of us, has introduced legislation already over the last few years based on the Silicon Valley Pain Index, and I would expect we're going to hear something today that leads us down that path again. And for some of you who have already, or in the past, brought us ideas that maybe have not yet matriculated into legislation, know that we're both committed to continue to working on those things. So again, I'm sure we'll hear more today. And with that, we'll let you introduce the panelists.
Thank you. Welcome. I'm Dr. Scott Meyers-Lipton. Recently retired at San Jose State University, where I was there for 24 years. I want to take, first off, before I talk, I just want to thank Senator Cortese, Assemblymember Kalra, who've really been at the forefront of promoting the pain index and talking about it. It has some recognition now in the Valley, but when we started, a lot of people did not want to talk to us and did not want to look at the report. So I really want to thank them for being at the Ash was there that very first time we did it. And so thank you, and Senator Cortese has been incredibly helpful in promoting this work. So let me just give you some sense of why we started it. So I just want to take you back to 2005 in August, Hurricane Katrina hit. And I remember watching that with my students, and they were stunned about what they saw. But if you understand racism in America, we as sociologists were not stunned by that. We understand how poverty plays out and who's left behind and who's not. And so a group of students decided to respond to that, and we actually worked for 4 years for a massive public works project to rebuild the Gulf Coast kind of from bottom up, paying living wages, to rebuild using kind of FDR's model. We were ultimately not successful in that effort. And sometimes you win and sometimes you lose, but we learned how to kind of do social change in that time. There was a professor there though, and he had the Katrina Pain Index, and you can look it up. He would produce it every 2 or 3 years, not annually, and he would take a stat and put a number to it, a low number, and it would go from 0 to a very high number, and it would talk about how racism was playing out in the rebuilding and the recovery. And I'm like, that's a great idea. We should do something like that for Silicon Valley. Well, we're all busy and we've got kids and all that and jobs, and I put in the back of my head, and fast forward now to 2020. So almost 15 years later. And that was the year that Ahmaud Arbery was killed. That was the year that Breonna Taylor was killed. That was the year George Floyd was murdered. And it was really, I look at it as a youth rebellion. I mean, it was a really young people of color and some white folks, but young though, 15, 14, 20 on the streets in San Jose and around the country. And I decided at that point, like, what can I do? And I think that's a question for all of us, like, what can we do to respond to the crisis we're in? And I remember that idea of the pain index. I said to Bill Armeline, I don't know if you know Dr. Bill Armeline at San Jose State, was still connected to the Human Rights Institute, but started that organization. I said, Bill, if I write this report called the Silicon Valley Pain Index, will the Human Rights Index release it? And he said, absolutely. Well, 24 hours, every day for 4 weeks, on middle of June, maybe 3 or 4 weeks after George Floyd was murdered, we produced our first pain index. And so every year we've done that to draw attention. Like, we didn't have to go to Minnesota, we didn't have to go to Kentucky, we didn't have to go to Georgia to see how institutionalized racism is playing out right here in our community, in our valley. So that was the beginning. And so we're going to release our 5th annual report coming on June 18th. I welcome you to that. You'll see news about it on June 18th at San Jose State, where we gather with Carlos, because that's our touchstone, our space. We'll gather there and release the 5th annual report. And just so you know, we're gathering the data, and it really started with myself and Bill, and now we have a team of 5 students. It's kind of amazing. We've got 3 other faculty involved. Dr. Angie Buckner and I are actually co-writing it this year from public health. Michael Dow is involved, so it's a much bigger thing. So it's a wonderful thing. So let me say, what is what is it? What is the pain index? You can look it up, by the way. Type in Human Rights Institute, Silicon Valley Pain Index. You can find all 4 reports, which I'm going to talk about today. But it's a meta-analysis. We actually don't do any of the research. We gather the research. And so I'm inviting anyone here in the community, I see one of my colleagues here, anyone that has data about how racism is playing out, please send it to us. And we get data that way, that should be included in the pain index. And it's an evolving document. It started with, we're looking at 5 things. Again, using the Katrina pain index idea, going from low to high. So it starts usually with 0. Like in the very first, in 2020, we highlighted that 3 large tech companies in Silicon Valley had 0 black workers, 10,000 employees or more, and not 1 black worker. So we highlighted, that was our 0, and then we went from there up. So it focuses on tech is one of our areas, Silicon Valley, because we're Silicon Valley, focuses on the tech community. It focuses on wealth, which is really important. We sociologists, we love income, and we talk a lot of income and the various aspects, but really another really important factor is wealth, because wealth provides security. And so we look at wealth, we look at income and self-sufficiency, we look at police conduct is another part of that. So they're up there. Those are the major focuses in housing, because housing is such a crisis, right? But police conduct, because it was born out of George Floyd. And so, and the other killings I talked about. So we want to look at how is San Jose and Santa Clara County and San Mateo County, the Silicon Valley, how are we doing with police conduct? So those are the 5 areas. And then it's expanded. We brought in other professors with public health and environmental sustainability and LGBTQ+. So it's gotten bigger. So that's the framework. Let me just say some of the key highlights. And with this kind of document, it has 100 stats. And it's from 0 to a very large number, usually 2 or 3 trillion, usually of how much money is being made in the tech world. So it goes that direction. And you can just so you know, you can go to it, you can look at the number and then click on the citation and you can get the study where it comes from. So if you want to go do that, please do it. It's worth the read. What I thought we'd do is just to get some numbers, because it's all about numbers, but really it's about, as Assemblymember Kalra and Senator Cortese said, it's really about people behind these numbers. But this document is about numbers. But obviously, remember, there's people. So we focus, the first thing, this is on tech. I have Apple. I don't know if you all have Apple computers. I have them, and it's good that you don't, but I do, unfortunately. But we try to really, because Apple's so well known, we really try to kind of smack Apple. So I'm always like, so out of the Apple executives and senior managers, there are no African American men out of 126. 1% is the amount of venture capital funds that went to African American startups. So you can kind of read through this. 1.5 is the board of directors that are Latinx. At the largest 200 tech firms, 3% African American. 2% Latinas in the tech sector, even though Latinas are about 13% of the population of Santa Clara County. So it goes through these, and these are from all the 4 reports, right? And look at the numbers, you know, I already said 3 large companies have no black workers. 57% of the jobs are tied to the tech world. Again, 73% tech companies have 0 African Americans and 70% Latinx on executive boards. So just very, you know, kind of wherever you look in the community, whether it's about, particularly at the senior levels, at the executive levels, you know, very few Latinx as well as African Americans. And then at the same time, this incredible, I should say this one number, 86% jobs held by African Americans at Apple are low paid. So there's African Americans but are low paid or administrative roles. And then this amount of money being made, 280 billion Google, you know, this other number which shows 394 billion Apple. And during that pandemic, you know, it was just skyrocketing, 30 billion every year. So while the middle and the lower income folks were really suffering, the elite were just doing incredibly well, right? Go back to that one number. I like this number because it shows you, you know, they'll say how much they give, but they gave $72 million, Zoom, Google, Intel, and Adobe, that they gave locally to nonprofits in 2021. That's 0.02% of the total revenues. So they're just making billions and giving so little to our community. Look at the amount of wealth. By the way, so as I said, we ourselves don't, we just report on the data that's out there. So I don't know if you all know about the Silicon Valley Index. I call it the nice index because they're a lot nicer than we are in the sense of like we try to be a little bit, you know, because they have the billionaires in the room when they're reporting. So I understand why they might not be able to say as much as we can because we don't have that, right? So if you look at this number, I went to the lead author of the pain index. I said, look at they kept reporting on the 1%. I said, we don't care about the 1%. Those are like doctors and lawyers, and they're not the people that we care about. We care about the 0.01%, the 0.1%. What's going on there? Because that's when I've been studying wealth. That's where the real movement is happening. And so they produce these numbers for us. So we now have, and we'll have them for the next year too. I don't want to tell you, but they've actually gotten worse. More wealth to the top. So 0.01% is 8 individuals. The 0.01 is 56 individuals or households. The 0.1 is 950 households. 10 plus billion, a billion, and 30 million plus. And the 30 million plus number is important because Bill Gates Sr. said, up to 30 million, you're thinking about the money, but anything over 30 million, you're thinking about how to control society. And so I think it's a really, it kind of gets to understand, like, above 30 million, they're thinking about the control of society. So these folks have, right, I think that's a pretty great, powerful number. These 8 people have 6 times more wealth than half of our population in Silicon Valley, 500,000 people, right? 56 people have 13 times more wealth. So we say we broke away from Britain, which had, princes and kings, but we kind of have that today, right? Again, that top 0.1%, they increased their wealth, their net worth by 71% when most people were suffering. Again, who are those people? Mostly all white men, median age is almost 60, compared to the Silicon Valley households, split between male and female, 29% white, median age 38, between who has the wealth and who doesn't. So this is numbers on self-sufficiency, and I'll go through them quickly, and we'll get to our panelists next. But if you look at the numbers on self-sufficiency, I think a good thing to think when you're looking at these numbers, or particularly on income, is think of Dr. King. Of course, April 4th was just a couple of days ago, and the murder of Dr. King on that anniversary. He would say the curious formula has been with us from the founding of the country. 2 times the bad, 1/2 the good. That's what racism is. And while everything has changed since 1968, nothing has changed. If you can get around that, like, yeah, we don't have signs anymore, kind of the worst parts of that we don't have, but the basic economic undergirding of that system is still with us, because it's about 2 times to 3 times as bad for folks of color. So white, that's looking at income and looking at basically at self-sufficiency. Do they earn enough money to meet most basic needs without assistance? 18% for white, 46 and 57%, 46 and 57% for Latino and Black, 5% white living in poverty, and with looking at Asian American community, you have to say we kind of break that up and look at the variety of different Asian American groups. So Asian Indians at 2%, Korean at 5%, Filipino at 7%, Vietnamese at 10%, right? So it's different depending on the community and the history of which people have come and experienced the racism here. 60% for African Americans. So again, 2 to 3 times as bad. Income per capita is same, 32,000, 44,000 for Blacks and Latinos, Asian Americans, and that's again skewed depending on which Asian American group. You have to go in there and look at the various groups. But whites, it's 91,000, so 2 to 3 times. Income for full-time workers, same idea. So housing, going back to we're number 1. I used to do a chant with my students, we're number 1, and we're number 1 in youth homelessness. How it affects at San Jose State, we have over 4,000 of our students experience homelessness at least one night at San Jose State, over 11% of our student population. And that's a number from our own study, because the students would say that to the university, they didn't believe them. So they did a study and they found on their own study 11% of our population experiences homelessness, which means they're in their cars, they're in, it used to be Martin Luther King Library. They might be at a friend's, just couch surfing for a little bit, but they don't have a place to be. 14% of African American households who can afford a median price, so that's 86 that cannot. Black home ownership, not all things stay the same. That number, you can see, has gotten worse. 26% in Santa Clara County today. It was 35%. Still that 2 to 3 to 1 number. This number is always powerful. About a person dies on our street every day in the richest country, in the richest area of that country, right? This gets to the median monthly rent in dollars, over $3,000. It's broken down by bedrooms. The number of homeless people, that number's coming out, so we'll see how we did in the coming days. It looks like we're going to go up because there's some early indicators of that, but we'll see those numbers. They're going to come out any day now to see this next year. But look at that median sales price, as you all know, 1.3 million, and you need to make 245,000 to afford a home. So police conduct, right? This is a powerful number for police conduct, because it was born out of George Floyd and others. There's been 0 police prosecutions of people who have been killed by our police in San Jose, 15 of the 19 of which are folks of color. And it ranks San Jose Police Department as the number 1 in the most fatal encounters that it has, more than Oakland, more than San Francisco. So this is looking at the criminal justice system. 40 is the number of young Black youth detained for every 1,000 young African Americans, in comparison to 10 for Latinx, 2 for white, and 1 for Asian Pacific Islander. 362 is the number of police officers that receive 1 complaint from the public about their conduct. It goes up, that's an increase every year. 66 officers receive 2 complaints, 20 officers receive 3, 8 officers receive 4. And this deals with looking at who's most likely to be stopped by the police. Latinx are 2 times more likely than whites. African Americans are 7 times more likely in a non-traffic stop. And then Latinx folks are injured by the San Jose Police Department about 3 times the number in comparison to whites when violence is used. So this is some numbers how we expanded. It's important to look at, right? 5.2 degrees is the difference in Fahrenheit of the average temperature between the Rose Garden, which we all know is a predominantly white and wealthy community, and East San Jose, where folks of color and working class folks are. Even though they're just 6 miles apart, it's a 5-degree difference, right? Former has more tree covering and less pavement. These 2 numbers are important. 99% is the risk of a 3-foot flood hitting Silicon Valley between today and 2050. That's like almost for certain, which would submerge these amount of homes, 27 schools, and these hazardous waste sites, and the 212 EPA listed contaminated sites. And then a 99.8% risk out of 100 that Santa Clara County has, which is a double when it comes to looking at the risk of coastal flooding and droughts and heat waves. We look at public health. 11 is the average wait time in hours to receive emergency services at Santa Clara County Valley Medical Center. 76% of doctors believe that VMC is not providing adequate care. 90% believe they're not providing enough resources. And of course, we have a strike going on right now among nurses. I put a couple of these LGBTQ plus, is something we've expanded on, is just to show, because it's an important community, 43% of transgender, non-binary, intersex and gender expanse, that was the language they used in the study. People in Santa Clara County report difficulty finding work, almost half, and 76 attribute to their identity. And 46% have bachelor's degrees, yet 42% are under $25,000, and 70% report struggling to get by. So it kind of gives us an insight into the LGBTQ plus community. So with that, so that's the kind of the report, in a, it's 4 reports into one, but it gives you some sense of the pattern of how racism and class and gender are playing out in our community. So now we will turn to, go this way, we'll turn, if I can get it going. Can we get that maybe one side over? That way? Oh, maybe I'm at the end, I have to go back this way. To our guest speakers. Let's go here to the guest speakers. Yay! One more is there. So here's the economic inequality discussion with Maria Noel, who's sitting to my left, and Megan Abell next to Maria. And what we've asked them to do is maybe just address the first question. Can you see the first question? Which is, both of you work on the ground trying to tackle this issue of economic inequality. It's been kind of highlighted here. And are you able to provide extra insights based on your firsthand experiences? Maybe answer that, and then we'll go to the second question. But answer that one first. Maria, maybe say a little bit about yourself.
Yeah. Good afternoon. I feel like we need to take a collective breath after. It's a lot, right? Like it is a lot. I know we know that because we're living it, but to see it all in one place, it is a lot. It is a lot. It's a lot. And also just want to take the opportunity to thank Senator Cortese and Assemblymember Kalra, because every time we get to share space with them, it's just another reminder of how much it matters who are in those positions of power when we're in the room and we're not in the room, and are fighting for us on a daily basis. So thank you. Thank you. I feel like we should give them some love. So I am Maria Noel Fernandez, and I'm the Executive Director of Working Partnerships USA, and this is my boss, my son, my 4-year-old, Diago, who's with us today. I feel like we could pull the thread on so many pieces of this, but the piece that I was asked to really share a little bit more is particularly the piece around the tech industry. And 7 years ago, we, in collaboration with several different organizations, put together a campaign coalition called Silicon Valley Rising. And it was really the motivation behind that, and the idea behind that was that in some ways, everyone was talking about the tech industry, and everyone was talking about Silicon Valley as this symbol of inequality in the nation. And everyone was starting to talk about how there was no diversity in the tech industry. But what we knew is that in some ways that was an incomplete story. And the piece that we set out to really uncover was that actually there are people of color on these campuses. The thing is, we don't think about them. And the thing is that we have them in a 2-tier system. And what I mean by that is that we have cafeteria workers, we have the shuttle bus drivers, we have the janitors, we have the security officers that are on those campuses every single day, making it possible for those companies to thrive in our community, and we don't think about those folks as part of the tech industry. And so what we worked on and continue to work on is, number one, the people who are on those front lines saying, hey, I'm the tech industry too, and telling their own stories and working to support them in doing that, but also digging a little deep into, so then what are we seeing in the tech sector for those workers? And so I want to just first give a shout out, they're not here, but I feel like it's important. We got to work with a couple of researchers, Chris Benner and Kyle Neary from UC Santa Cruz, and so really appreciate the work that they did with us. And I want to just highlight a few things. So the information sector in Santa Clara County alone has quadrupled in size since 2001, accounting for 34% of the region's total economic growth. And what I'm about to say, to me, every time I see it is shocking, and so I'm giving you that highlight here. Hopefully, it's probably shocking for you too. The tech industry as a whole has added surprisingly few jobs since 1990. Few jobs. Over the past 24 years, direct employment in industries classified as tech products and services grew by 31%, an annual average growth rate of just 1.1%. Here's why, to me, that's important to lift up here. Part of the reason is the rise of subcontracting. As the tech industry has grown, it has increasingly outsourced both blue-collar and white-collar work, which I know we're going to hear about in just a minute here. So over the past 24 years, the number of Silicon Valley jobs in the subcontracting industry has grown 3 times as fast as overall Silicon Valley employment. Diversity, and the lack thereof, has of course become a major challenge of the tech industry. And let me say this, what I also know is that post-pandemic with layoffs and cuts, guess what departments are getting cut first too? Your DEI. Right? And so while for years we've been saying that that is a priority and this is how we're going to invest, we're going to build these teams and invest these dollars, not only are we not telling the full picture, but are we really investing? Are we actually making change on these issues? So the overwhelming majority of Black and Latino workers in the tech sector start out in blue-collar jobs. By subcontracting out nearly all of the blue-collar work, tech companies have really ended up with not just a glass ceiling, but we like to say a concrete wall. White-collar workers, again, we know are also impacted by contracting out. Compared to direct tech employees, and I'm sure we know someone, I feel like we all know somebody that is maybe not a direct employee, but is a contractor for a tech company, right? I see a lot of nodding. White-collar workers in likely contract occupations earn less than half as much, and are 2.6 more times likely to be Black or Latino. So even comparing equivalent occupations, white-collar workers employed in contracting industries earn an average of 35% less than their counterparts. And so what we are really talking about, and the way that we talk about this, is that we're seeing 2 things. We see occupational segregation in the tech industry, and we see a 2-tier system. And those promises of fabulous jobs, those promises of maybe what we imagine of workers playing hacky sack on the lawn in front of the tech company, getting free childcare and free fancy food and all of these perks, right, that we maybe think about when we think of the tech industry, doesn't quite apply to everybody. And if you're likely Black and Latino and you're subcontracted, definitely is likely to not apply to you. And so now things are shifting. We have a lot of work to do. I feel like I don't want to go into question 2, but I want to just highlight that as we talk about the tech sector and the tech industry, we also are including those workers, those faces, those folks that really allow the tech companies to be in this community. Thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for teeing me up, Maria. I'm Megan Abell. I'm the Senior Director of Advocacy at Tech Equity Collaborative. We are an organization that works to address inequities within tech and hold tech companies accountable for the economic harms that they create. As an organization, we produce original research on the tech industry, and we also engage in policy advocacy and sponsor legislation in the Capitol, and have worked closely with both of our hosts today, Assemblymember Kalra and Senator Cortese, on that front. And one of the reports that we've done is on this phenomenon of contract work within tech. We have a report called the Contract Worker Disparity Project, where we did the first of its kind research into what the status of contract work was within the industry and how this really was impacting workers. And as Maria Noel really teed up for us, the status of the quality of jobs in Silicon Valley is not very good. There are workers who are experiencing career immobility, and they are stuck in a cycle of contract work. And the system is designed in this way to operate, to create instability for workers. What I mean by this is that we found in our research that workers were stuck in what we like to call a cycle of permatemping. Staffing agencies that provide these subcontracted workers to tech companies will often go to people who are re-entering the workforce after having a child, who are new in their career after graduation, or trying to make a career change, and will say, hey, this is a great way for you to get your foot in the door to all of these high wages and benefits that you believe the tech sector can provide you. And workers, on that hope that a 6-month contract will get converted to direct employment, will take a subcontracted job at Google or Apple or any of the like. And what these workers find is that despite being high performers, despite working side by side with directly employed workers at these companies working on the same projects, they are treated differently. They do not have access to the benefits and the resources the direct workers do, and they face barriers in getting converted to direct employment. And in fact, what we're seeing more and more is that these direct employment jobs that provide stability to families and provide good wages to families in our community are fewer and far between. Many of us probably also know someone who had worked in the tech industry but was recently laid off in the last year. And that's something that has hit the community really hard. And we see these massive numbers in news reports about thousands of workers and thousands of jobs getting cut. These companies aren't actually operating with that many fewer workers. What has happened over the last couple of years is that direct workers are being laid off, and those jobs are increasingly getting converted into contract roles. Across the state in 2021, there were 1.9 million contracted workers in the state across industries. Last year, that number grew to 2.1 million workers. So more and more we are seeing that these jobs that once provided benefits and long-term stability for workers and families are being converted to subcontracted jobs that provide no health benefits, no child care support, provide no stability, and workers are constantly on the hook hoping that their 6-month or 1-year contract is going to get renewed or is going to get converted to direct employment. And what this does in the workplace is it suppresses worker voice, right? It encourages workers to keep their head down, to not report instances of sexual abuse or racial discrimination in the workplace, right? To not speak up about problems that they're seeing, because they fear that if they do advocate for themselves, that their contract won't be renewed, that they'll be viewed as a troublemaker and their contract will be cut and some other worker will be brought in on a temporary or rolling contract basis. And so I think when we think about these numbers that the professor has illuminated for us, we really need to think about what are the structures that are undergirding producing these numbers. And one of those things is that the jobs that exist in this district are consistently degrading in quality. right? That the jobs that employers are providing are no longer good family sustaining jobs. And one of the mechanisms through which that is happening is through the proliferation of contract work. So I think it's really important for us to be aware of these structures and how they're impacting workers' ability to succeed in the workplace, to have stability for their families, and also the ways in which it's preventing workers from speaking up. And just to put a really, real example on this, Tech Equity, as I said, does policy advocacy. We've done a lot of work on this contract work issue, and we've sponsored several pieces of legislation in the legislature on this very topic. We had a worker who was an employee at Google, a subcontracted employee, and she testified at a hearing in the legislature talking about why it was necessary to, in this case, expand layoff protections for contract workers. The day after she testified at that hearing, her contract was cut. So it's really important, I think, for us to be aware of the power asymmetries that exist here, and how companies are, actively stifling out worker voice in order to ensure that they can continue to use this contract work model with very little oversight, because a lot of the worker protections that were hard fought by unions and hard fought by the labor unions do not apply to the subcontracted workforce. And so it's an incredibly vulnerable population of folks, and is a growing number of people, including my own fiance. I think, this is an issue that we're really thrilled to be able to bring to the conversation. I encourage everyone to go and Google Tech Equity Collaborative's Contract Worker Disparity Project and read the report. And to have these conversations with your representatives and have these conversations with your neighbors about how these work structures are affecting you in the community, and reach out to us because we would love to hear your stories.
So I think we have the criminal justice folks, Raj and Annalise and Alexis, maybe address the same question, which to yours is very similar, right? What are your initial thoughts on the police conduct numbers, criminal justice, and does your experience in the field line up with those stats? Maybe you two, and then we can go on to what are we going to do about it?
This on? Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks, Professor and Assemblymember Kalra and Senator Cortese for having me. Just as a way of background as I get into the question, so my name is Raj. I'm with an organization called Silicon Valley Debug, and it's actually a little surreal for me to hear some of the conversation earlier in the discussion, because the name debug actually comes in the wake of the violence of this economic system. So when we started as an organization, we were all temp workers, assembly workers, manufacturing workers, working in the warehouses in the back of these tech icons, who suffered the same indignities that are happening and lifted up in this report and on this panel. And so we actually took the name debug because we were all working on assembly lines with conveyor belts. And so if we were a conveyor belt, like I was making laser jet printers, and if the laser jet printer didn't work, you called the debug unit to inspect the product and get to the root cause and malfunction and expose it. And that's what we sort of saw our role in this larger Silicon Valley experiment of hyper-capitalism. How do we expose the problem so that we can make change, much like the Silicon Valley Pain Index has done. So it says a lot for me, and it's encouraging for me to see, the growing movement to challenge not just the tactics of this economic system, but the root of it as well. I'll address the question around policing that the professor mentioned, because I think there's a correlation that's not just in the origin story of the pain index, but I think there's a causal link of police violence and the pain inflicted by incarceration and the system. So if you look at the slides that were popped up earlier, the economic and political rationale that has allowed the concentration of wealth at the expense of so many, particularly people of color, of the exclusion of economic stability and opportunity, that has allowed that system to persist has been an approach which is to invisibilize the pain, to vanish those that are suffering from the pain. And principally, the way Silicon Valley has done that has been through policing, arresting, prosecution, and incarceration. And there is a wake of violence that happens as a result of that very intentional approach that has existed since our organization. And really the root of Silicon Valley has been born of that. If you want to see the pain depicted from these numbers in a real tangible way, they are sitting in handcuffs on curbs in San Jose. They're in the back of cop cars. They're in the jail and juvenile halls. They're on the buses on the way to prisons. And they're also in cemeteries, because in this effort to invisibilize the pain, people are harmed, hurt, and they're killed. And so you saw some of the numbers. I think the way the professor illustrated it was how many officers were prosecuted after they had killed a San Jose family member. So the organization I'm with now, and kind of evolution of what we've been as a platform, has been a place where families whose loved ones were killed by police have come together to organize to support each other. And if you look across that, certainly the racialized aspect of police violence comes across in that way. But how these families have been treated, not just by the district attorney's office, but really by the policing apparatus, I think is indicative of the intentionality of using police as a way to hold up and guard this accumulation of wealth economic model. The officers that killed family members here in San Jose were not prosecuted. A number of them actually were found guilty in a civil jury, federal jury verdicts against the city of San Jose that had to pay up millions of dollars because they identified the officers of unlawfully killing somebody. But what the economic political system of San Jose did is not only leave those officers not held accountable, they also awarded and rewarded those officers. A number of officers who had killed people in this city got promoted shortly after they were killed. Some of them were promoted after the verdict by a civil jury that said they were liable for the murder, and they were still raised up the ranks. And it is indicative, I think, of the numbers that these aren't. It's not just the fact that the professor had sort of thought and moved on this action during the George Floyd uprising, is that there really is a role that police and the carceral system plays to maintain this level of centralized wealth at the harm of so many others. And there is a very blatant racialized aspect to this. And certainly the numbers show it. You're going to see Latinos are arrested at 3 times their rate. The black community here usually around eight times their rate in the general demographic. But again, it's not that it's just in the data as a reflection of what's happening, is that there is an actual pronouncement of this racialized violence that really falls on deaf ears. So some of you all may have remembered just a few months ago now, a San Jose police officer named McNamara. Is that name familiar, folks? Some of us were at the same press conferences. This was an officer who killed a black man, who almost killed a black man, a rising prominent football star in downtown San Jose. This young man, Quan Green, should be celebrated as a hero. He had disarmed somebody at the La Vix in downtown, was coming outside, and McNamara shot him. Luckily, fortunately, by the grace of God, he survived. Months later, it came out through depositions that he was on this running text string with other officers pronouncing his hatred for black people. He said on the text that he would kill black people and used all kinds of other vile language. This was national news and had no impact on the structure or level of accountability of policing in San Jose. When some people in this room as well, when we asked the department in the city to release the names of the officers involved, they declined to even say the other officers, meaning people had to go around in this city, if you were black, if you're brown, knowing that there was armed gunmen that had already pronounced their intention to kill, that were allowed to legally do their job, and we had to pay for it. That's what happens to maintain a system like that. And so when you see the numbers of use of force, right? Most of those numbers, which have tremendous racial disparities, most of those police contacts are for innocuous interactions or innocuous crimes. It's mainly what we would call cover charges. It's excuses for police to vanish certain people, to get them out of the downtown so it looks a certain way, get a certain element not on the streets. So that means it's using charges like resisting arrest, disturbing the peace, trespassing. These are misdemeanor infractions at most, but they become lethal. And so there's a level of violence to maintain this system, and the chief operators to maintain that violence has been police, and it has been prosecutors, and it has been those that have enabled the carceral system to continue. I could talk about kind of what communities are doing in response, and I'll talk about this moment now because it is the pendulum swing of the George Floyd uprising moment. We are on the receiving end of whatever grounds we gained a few years ago. It is probably in a much more punishing state politically than I can remember locally. But some of those families have taken the energy from the George Floyd moment and have worked to create some change. So those same families I talked about that lost loved ones to police, they had advocated and actually conceived of the idea of non-police crisis intervention teams. And so we have that in Santa Clara County now. It's called Trust. That was born from those exact families. We have a movement of some people that are here, really when Senator Cortese was leading stuff in Santa Clara County, that stopped the construction of a jail and try to use those resources to move into mental health treatments. And because of the piece of legislation that Assemblymember Kalra made in the Racial Justice Act, we can now litigate racism in the court when someone is wrongfully profiled on the street, like those numbers said, and illegally charged with a crime. We could declare racism in the court. I can't tell you how profound of an experience that is, given what it's normally like in a punishment system like that. So I could explain a little bit more maybe later on about what this current model and this new carceral mayor, Mac Mahan, is doing and ways that we can fight back. But yeah, so that's sort of our correlation of policing and this pain index right now.
Good afternoon, my name is Annalisa. I'm the statewide policy director of Young Women's Freedom Center. We're an organization that works to decarcerate and decriminalize young women, trans folks, and gender expansive folks of all genders across the state of California. We work across multiple sites in the state, including the Bay Area and Los Angeles. My role specifically is to oversee some of the statewide campaign work, the legislation that we support, we co-sponsor. And here with me, she'll introduce herself in a minute, but is my colleague who does the work on the ground here in Santa Clara County. And so we're going to share our time today, but I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the trends that we're seeing across the state in relation to some racial justice issues here in California. So I just wanted to speak to some data in 2023. So in 2023, there were 526 detentions in Santa Clara County's juvenile hall. 75% of those were Latinx youth, 14% of those were Black youth. There were 65 youth inside the James Ranch in Morgan Hill, and 84% of those were 84% was Latinx and 7% was Black. And so I want to take it back a couple years ago when we were established here in Santa Clara County. I was one of the co-founders of the Santa Clara County site here at the Young Women's Freedom Center. When we started, we began with some research in the county, and we found that at that time, while only 30% of the population in Santa Clara County was Latinx youth, they made up 80% of the population on the girls' side in juvenile hall, and 75% of those were given gang affiliations written down in their probation file. So what that tells me is, when I look at that data and I look at the data from 2023 and the intakes in juvenile hall and the ranch, is that while we've made so much progress, we're still seeing the same racial issues. And even though I spoke to what we found on the girls' side in 2019, that tells me that it's pretty consistent on the young men's side too. So here at Young Men's Freedom Center, we have two different approaches, and so we do some of the work that Alexis is going to talk about, the economic work and the advocacy work on the ground in the court, but we also do statewide work. And so the reason for that is that when a young person comes in contact with the criminal justice system or juvenile justice system, oftentimes it's because there's a lot that's happened before they even got to that point. And what we're doing when we're putting them in the courtroom and deciding that they need to go through the door to juvenile hall and, you know, be incarcerated is we're telling them that they're the problem. And we're not looking at the larger context. We're telling them they're the problem and not the context and the everything that led them up to that point, right? The housing instabilities, the familiar relationships and trauma and abuse that's happened before then. And so what I want to thank Senator Cortese and Assemblymember Kalra, who have been some of the biggest champions of the work that we've done, but some of the work that we're doing right now to target that, but also create statewide change, is to ensure that in the courtroom we're looking at the larger context, but also sending the message to young people that they're not disposable and that they're not the issue. And if our young people, we care about our next generation because they are our next generation, then we need to cultivate the leaders that they are and be able to rely on them and their expertise that they have in their own lives and support them to create sustainability for themselves. I don't want to take up too much of my colleagues' time, but just on the legislative level, what we're doing right now is we're working on a couple different pieces of legislation, one of them to create alternatives to youth monetary restitution, to be able to allow for more opportunities for community-based restoration programs, because we know that when a young person again comes in contact with the system, they're oftentimes not coming to us whole, and so we need to make the whole situation, we need to come at it within a holistic approach. We're also going to be releasing, so look out for a statewide report that we worked on over the last 2 years and actually has some narrative directly from our young people who talked about their experiences in the juvenile justice system. But one of those things being that we are hoping to change local policies, because what we're seeing, especially with young women, is that they're being incarcerated oftentimes for minor offenses and technical violations. And so technical violations, for those who maybe aren't familiar with the terms, are violations that aren't actually against the law. They're only being charged with these violations because they're on probation or they're underage. We're also hoping to co-create some legislation around creating better, more flexible funding streams that go to CBOs. So for example, back in 2020 when we started working with the young women in the county and who are incarcerated, some of the funding, you know, with COVID, there were housing issues, there were substance use issues, et cetera. And so we worked on the ground to be able to provide housing, to be able to provide resources that folks stay connected with school. And unfortunately, we were told through a lot of those funding streams that that's not possible. You can't fund someone's housing. You can't get a hotel room for someone for one night. And our response was, well, yes, we understand, you know, certain restrictions, but also if I'm just bringing this young person to come and eat food and paying for them to do that, I'm still sending them back to the conditions that even brought them to the system in the first place. And so part of our report will include some recommendations about thinking of more innovative funding opportunities, and then also better housing. So one of our initiatives is Beloved, which is our sibling org that is working to support the full family with housing. And yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and pass it over to Alexis now. Thank you.
All right, can you all hear me? Okay. Hi, I'm Alexis Roman. I'm the site director at the Santa Clara County site, and I do work very closely alongside my colleague, Annalisa Ruiz. And while she beautifully captured a lot of the incredible work that the organization has done to really center the experiences and impact of those who are those directly impacted by the juvenile and adult justice systems, I think one part of this conversation that I deeply appreciate, not only with the numbers that honestly do not start only, right, because we do this work every day, but thinking about how do we actually invest into the young people who are experiencing a lot of this horror, trauma, violence on the day-to-day, and I wanted to just uplift something that Annalisa has said. I do a lot of the direct programming. I still do the work in facilities with young girls and trans youth and gender expansive youth here in the community. And one thing that we commonly see, right, is girls getting locked up for their own safety. And that narrative really is just to say that they will receive access, right, when they're found in the system. But conversations quickly let us know that they're not getting access to care that is rooted in safety, in responsive to their culture, their gender, their identities. And often a lot of the young people that we work with require a really deep connection with a person who understands their lived experience, and there's not people who in the system are suited to care for the needs of these young folks. And so really at the Young Women's Freedom Center, while we don't want to see folks in facilities, we make sure that we center them as the experts in all of the work that we do. And at every point of the juvenile justice system, they make very clear that they experience that the verbal, physical, and emotional abuse that sticks with them post-incarceration. And so when we think about the reentry needs that young people aren't receiving, and actually are receiving from community-based organizations like the Women's Freedom Center and DBUG and other organizations who do that on the groundwork to make sure that not only are their basic needs first met, but if they have access to meaningful employment opportunities, because obviously the statistics show that not only are they very properly represented in the employment sector, but they have little to no room for growth when organizations and entities and agencies don't see them as fully capable. And so one thing that I do want to talk about in this work, right, is often we hear about, well, what are the alternatives? So like, what are folks doing, right, to address these challenges that young folks are facing? And it's centering them into the work, centering them as experts. And so a large part of my role prior to my position now as a director was doing a lot of the program managing and program coordinating, and we found that centering youth through research and being in positions where they can make local and statewide policy changes, because who's better fit to make change from those who are actually living and experiencing these situations every day. And so with that, I did want to just emphasize one of the most recent things that the Women's Freedom Center has been able to launch with the support of some funding through an economic empowerment program where LGBTQ youth and trans youth were most heavily impacted by this ability to receive a guaranteed basic income for a little under a year, but we're able to identify ways that communities and county legislators can actually support funding streams to make sure that young people have the supports to be able to create goals for themselves and identify what is it that they need to be successful addressing mental health, what does safe, affordable housing look like for them, and those are things that the county doesn't have available for young people, especially those who are navigating multiple systems, not just one. And so, I don't know if you can go back to the question just to make sure that I answered it, but really thinking about, the trends with police misconduct and how a lot of our young people are most often pushed and funneled into the system because of the way that they look and the way that they speak and being assertive, right? Because they know what they need and they're not being listened to. And I really want us to encourage everyone to remember that we were, and myself included, is still a young person, right? And we were all young people, and they know what they need best. And it's time that systems stop deciding what it is that a young person needs.
Thank you so much. So we're going to answer some of the questions that you put forward. I just wanted to ask, the first one is that since you've been tracking the data in the pain index, have you seen initiatives, policies, or bills introduced to offset the disparities? So what? So I wanted to highlight a couple of proposals and that have been put forward. Senator Cortese put forward SB 333 in response to youth homelessness. That number we were talking about, we're number one. And it was really, Senator Cortese wanted to direct it toward college students, but once you direct toward college students, it gets into all sorts of questions around Pell Grants. So it got it directed toward high school students. And so it actually passed the California Senate 34-4. It's still in the Assembly, but it would give a guaranteed income that was mentioned earlier to high school seniors, 15,000 high school seniors who were McKinney-Vento, which are recently homeless youth in the state of California. And so it's still in Assembly, so but it passed the Senate 34-4. Another idea came out of that. It came down to Susan Ellenberg, and because it's kind of stuck up in Sacramento, and maybe Senator Cortese, you could say a little bit later how you got that money, but a pot of money was brought to Santa Clara County for 50 high school seniors for 3 months at $1,500 a month for those McKinney-Vento students. So as I understand it, Bill Wilson Center will be overseeing that this summer. Congressmember Khanna secured $4.1 million for the Silicon Valley African American Cultural Center that is going to be for housing and on-site health clinic. And I know that he was deeply impacted, has been deeply impacted by the pain index. So I think those are a couple of ideas. And I would say this, the whole idea of the pain index was, yeah, to have town halls like this, but then to have action. So my hope is that we can come up with ideas and put forward ideas. I wanted to get to 2 other questions and get to these real solutions. People asked about the pain index, so I just want to say briefly, people asked about the education focus. So there's usually some education, so we go to the pain index at the Human Rights Institute, there's usually a couple of stats, and comparing schools in Saratoga and Los Altos compared to the east side about funding, which is usually 2 and 3 times the funding of what folks get, as well as suspension rates for African American and Latino youth compared to whites. And so there's that in there. And then on teachers, if you're interested, there's a documentary that's been done on the pain index. It's out on PBS. I know the director, he gave me the website, so as long as you don't post it, it'll be fine. So if you want to email me, I'm glad to send it to you. And 2 teachers are highlighted in there and their struggle to stay in San Jose being teachers. So that issue is directly impacted, along with Maria Noel and the work of that she's doing. So that's that, and then anything else about the teachers? One person mentioned about disadvantaged Asian American groups, Vietnamese, Filipinos, Cambodians. Just so you know, we're dependent on what the reports are out there. We have really stressed, and you'll see the change on the 2nd and 3rd years to really go after those numbers of the various ethnic groups that are represented within the Asian American community. So those numbers are in there. They weren't so much in what I said today, but they are in the document. So please realize those are in there. One came, and I think this is the real question for me that I think a lot about. And so what are some real solutions to support the African American community, wealth, home ownership, employment? So I'm just going to say my 3 things that I dream about, and then I'll turn it over to you here, your ideas. Because to me, while I think, there's another, I just want to read this. It says, this is to Ash Kalra and to Dave Cortese, the Latino community needs more support. Students' access to university, housing, support the economic, Latinos is a really serious issue. Don't forget the Latinos. So the Latinos are not forgotten in the index. And so, but I just want to say that was said for Senator Cortese from Martinez Ortega. Getting to that question about, these things I dream about, and they're not going to happen without a campaign. And if you know my work at all, like I have this hat around the pain index, but I also teach about social action. So it's not happening without social action. So I'm going to say my 3, and then I'll turn it over to you all to hear your all. So I would have 3 campaigns. One would be directed at venture capital funds, because that's where new businesses are created. So I would have a campaign to say no less than 10% of all venture capital funds should go to startup tech firms led by African Americans. And it could be expanded to people of color, and it should be then it's 14% of the population is United States is African American, so no less than 10%. And then if we're going to talk about folks of color, I had the same thing at 40%. No less than 40% of venture capital funds should go. So a second one is no less than 10% of all C-suites to entry-level jobs, including board of directors, should go to African Americans. So that would be a campaign directed at, let's say, Google or Apple But I think, and that idea, if you go back in history, was brought to us in the late 1990s by Jesse Jackson, that there should be a campaign. So if anyone's interested, come talk to me. I'm dreaming about that idea. And then the third is, this idea of housing. And I think the federal government should be involved, the state government, in down payments for housing for African Americans in light of the history. The feds created the red line maps that we still have in the result of today. Agent fees and closing costs should be subsidized, in my mind, by the real estate industry, who had a hand in the redlining, and private mortgage insurance subsidized by the large banks, since they all actively participated in redlining. So those are just 3 ideas that I dream about, and I'm glad to brainstorm. But maybe talk to you all about, what do you say about changing for African Americans and larger folks of color, wealth, home ownership, and employment? Is there anyone else on the panel would like to respond?
The union difference is a thing. Here's what I mean by that. When someone has a union, it's not just an opinion. People's wages, benefits, I'm talking paid leave, sick leave, pension, or a 401k, a voice on the job, knowing your rights. Again, voice on the job, so if there's a shift on your job, you are part of that shift. You get to be at the table. You get to be in relationship with your colleagues. You get to exert power. And so for me, if we want to be real about immediately shifting some of those numbers, it's about how do we actually grow the labor movement in Santa Clara County. And one quick thing I'll say about that too, is when we look at some of the wins around Silicon Valley Rising and around the tech challenges that we just talked about, from that work, 15,000 service workers that are cafeteria workers, janitors, etc., joined Unite Here, SEIU, USWW, and the Teamsters, and overnight, through the organizing, once they won a contract, overnight got a pay increase. Overnight, through the process, got paid leave, sick leave, and stuff that you're like, well, don't people out? No, people don't. They have the minimum, the state minimum, which, thank you, yes, we need that. But ultimately, we need to be developing out a power building strategy, and to me, being a part of a union and being part of the labor movement is a way to do that.
Anyone else? On the question of wealth?
I'll just say really briefly that I think one mechanism we need to continue to push on is accountability for these companies and transparency around these problems. I'm really proud that Tech Equity Collaborative sponsored a piece of legislation a couple of years ago, SB 1162, which was signed into law by the governor, to require that pay data on contract work be submitted to the state civil rights department. So what that means is that companies in our community that are hiding behind this 2-tiered work structure will now have that data laid bare. What many companies that produce these DEI reports will do is include the contract workforce in those reports. The contract workforce is more likely to be women and people of color, more likely to be non-binary. They're paid 25% less than their directly employed counterparts. They don't receive benefits. But these companies take the diversity in that contract workforce and tout it as an improvement in their company's diversity. And what this pay data reporting that the state now has access to through the law that we sponsored is to expose that that actually is a ruse. That the diversity that exists in tech exists in these contracted roles, and that will allow the state civil rights department to go after these companies for occupational segregation and to go after them for their role in deepening these disparities. So that first report that the State Civil Rights Department has done on this pay data is supposed to come out this summer, so we're super excited about that, and hopefully we might see some of those numbers in the next Silicon Valley Pain Index. But I think this transparency and accountability is one piece that we need to continue to push on, but that goes beyond just the State Civil Rights Department releasing a report. It goes to folks like you looking at those numbers and coming to these companies and creating noise and saying, why do these numbers numbers look so bad. What are your concrete plans to change this? So I think that, you know, the transparency and accountability can help, but it doesn't help without the complementary action. And so I'm so glad to see so many people here today that, you know, potentially can play that role.
Okay. I'll just add real quickly, I mean, I think the kind of larger umbrella in this is that these Silicon Valley industry tycoons aren't making their billions by accident that they're here. Their accumulation of wealth is because they're here. And there's a responsibility there, and there has been a very intentional avoidance of taxes. And there's no reason any of our municipalities, city or county, should have short-handed budgets when it comes to basic services and social services in the face of that. And so I think as part of that, I mean, I guess you could call that a wealth transfer to the communities that have been harmed directly as a result. And whether that's a campaign or adjustment or reimagination of the political construct, I think that's essentially what has to be confronted in Silicon Valley for any of these things that happen. Because there's no reason there should be a small pot of money for basic survival and services and everyone's struggling that we're talking about. And then you have a political class like Mayor Mahan, the police chief, the district attorney, that then advocates for those crumbles, that little bit left on the table of resources to then be used for incarceration and policing and harm when people are living on the street. So like some of these are real close in proximity. This idea of guaranteed basic income we know is a proven approach. That could be dramatically expanded to a lot of other communities. You know, we have really, because a lot of the work that folks here like Senator Cortese and Assemblymember Kalra does, we have new opportunities for people to come home from incarceration that didn't exist before. We got folks here that are home as a result of a movement that stood up and said that people shouldn't be dying in prison. But here in Silicon Valley, they're coming home to a valley that is practically unlivable. How does someone return from incarceration to the costliest place to live in the country and expect to survive and advance and succeed? We should be having guaranteed basic income for anyone coming back from the California prison system or Santa Clara County jails. We had proposed that to the county. I think Supervisor Ellenberg was supportive of the idea. I'm just putting everything on the table because I don't want to talk to you. But like, it got moved over to the county CEO office and then just fell into some sort of vortex. Like they all did the press releases and they got on the news talking about how they loved the idea. That thing went nowhere. While they went back in the lab to see how they could construct how to invest more resources in the county jail. So I think some of that has to be confronted in terms of the industry, then also the political class locally that has really protected that accumulation of wealth by just one industry.
Awesome. So I have another question about criminal justice. It says Trust is up for a vote in June to increase budgeting for more mental health crisis resources instead of police mental health responses. How does mental health factor into what you do? Incarceration rates, racism, question mark. Do you support this? So maybe the criminal justice folks can handle that.
Yeah, I could say for a fact that instead of investing it directly into the mental health resources and facilities, it should definitely go into gender responsive community-based programming that can support with young people's mental health. The amount of resources, again, I'll reiterate that facilities aren't structured or suited to fit the needs and address the needs of those who are not only justice impacted and have histories of generational poverty and trauma and violence and have parents who have also experienced incarceration, is that they're not also equipped with the staffing who have that lived experience to be able to best understand that young person's history. And so with that, I will also just speak a little bit about not personal stories, but really the experiences of the young people that I work with directly every day. who struggle to even access a mental health resource within 24 hours when they're experiencing a state of crises. And that is concerning, right? And so when you're in a facility also experiencing crises and don't have the capacity to really advocate for yourself because you don't have someone that you can confide in, we can lose young people in facilities, and we have, and we've seen it across the state. And so while my heart is saying, yes, any resource, it's also like, let's be careful about where those resources are going to and where we can redirect them.
So this question is, I'm not sure if anyone can answer, but I'll read it, it's important. What happens before, during, and after an encampment sweep? What procedures and our accountability is present or lacking? Can you acknowledge that sweeps, which are ongoing in our community, of houseless folks? Do you have that?
I have just a little, nothing happens, they just move somewhere.
That's what I would say.
Yeah, the people who have been swept, whose property have been taken, what shelter they have, and items they used to cook or live by, they get destroyed, and they move somewhere else to try to start their life over. Nothing.
When I was a professor, I was a faculty advisor of Students Against Sweeps, and I know in their research it was like $10,000 a sweep,
Yeah.
and we're doing it all the time.
And then they get informed, sometimes they get informed maybe 2 days.
Mm-hmm.
Later.
Yeah, absolutely, and I would add to that, I mean, because it is a dramatic increase of trying to criminalize, punish, and erase homeless people. At the same time, homelessness is increasing at the same time. And so, you know, part of the issue that happens is people getting moved may be the least harm that's going to happen to them in terms of the property that they have accumulated is destroyed or taken, but it also leads to arrests because police can use any excuse they want to put a charge. And so that means someone who is already unstable is then being arrested, is going to the jail. They may stay there even if they're released because it's not, maybe the district attorney's office doesn't file the charge. The harm's already been done. They've been in jail for a couple days, they come out, the property's taken, and now they're facing pending criminal charges. So that has been a very intentional policy that the police department has enforced, but secondly also has really been propagandized by the mayor. You know, he has been on a tirade under the guise of public safety and beautification, which is a pretty scary word in the context of the way he uses it, which is to say we need to get rid of homeless people. And so in the backdrop of this pain index, as people are struggling more than maybe historically they ever have, our city and county's response to people struggling with mental health, with extreme poverty and homelessness, with substance use, has been a criminal punishment carceral response, rather than a public health response, rather than a mental health response, rather than an emergency housing response. And so that's where some of these directions and resources are pretty naked in what they're trying to do. And the fact that they don't get pushed back to really emboldens them to do more. So in San Mateo County, just north of us, they have literally implemented a policy that says it's a misdemeanor to sleep outside. That is the direct interpretation of criminalization of poverty, and it's something that is becoming really more the norm in San Jose and Silicon Valley.
So thanks so much. We got through like 2/3. We have 1/3 left. I have to say we're running out of time. So I'll stay here. I'm glad to answer the questions if you have them specifically you want to ask me, or if the other panelists maybe they could stay for a moment. But I want to turn to Assemblymember Kalra for some concluding remarks.
Thank you, Professor, and I want to also thank everyone on behalf of Senator Cortese. He had an engagement to go to. He had a hard stop he had to take off, and I think it's encouraging that although we went over time, we still have a great turnout here of folks that are engaged and listening. And I really want to thank the panel for really giving us an insight from an economic perspective that we don't often hear. And It's really important for us to have whole conversations about our economy, not just from the perspective of those that are benefiting from the ecosystem that they created. And just a little bit on the last point on the unhoused and what have you, one thing that I think is encouraging from a public perspective, and I don't know if all of you see it, and this is probably more anecdotal than it is data-driven, but right near my house, where my father and I live at Branham in Monterey, they're building a very large transitional housing. Couple hundred, I think at least, individuals will be able to stay there off the streets. They go there, and then after being there for a few months, they help them to find permanent housing. And when I look at next door, which still can be a pretty nasty place sometimes when you go online, and there's still, don't get me wrong, there's some pretty nasty things that are said about this particular development. I'm encouraged that a lot of people are pushing back now. I think a lot of residents, a lot of neighbors are recognizing how hard it is to live here, and would rather have a safe, clean place for people to live and help them get back on their feet. And I hope that we continue to see this sense of compassion grow. But ultimately, when we look at things like the pain index, it really connects us to what I oftentimes, and others as well, oftentimes say when you think about budgets, for example. Budgets are moral documents, whether it's the federal budget and how much we're spending on weapons and military versus healthcare and uplifting folks in poverty, or whether it's a local budget, a city budget, a county or state budget, and how much we're spending on sweeping people rather than actually supporting people. And so I hope that you learned a lot, or at least got a sense of, okay, you know what, there's a lot more for each of us to do, to learn more, and to see what it is that's actually happening in the community around us. The pain index is a great starting point and a great conversation starter with you and your family and your friends. Say, you know what, we're not the only ones that are feeling this pain, or maybe we're a little bit more comfortable than others, but there's more that we can do to have our voice heard, to uplift others. Or we need to do more to hold these tech companies accountable to the enormous amount of wealth that they're creating for themselves, and it's going to other places and not staying here in our community. And I really appreciate everyone up here for highlighting so many of those issues and kind of the interconnectedness between homelessness and the criminal justice system, poverty, our jobs and economic situation. You may have heard the news that we created over 300,000 jobs this last month, and it's being hailed by the Biden administration. But you have to dig deeper. What kinds of jobs are they? Are people still able to survive on a minimum wage? Or do we need to do more? Creating jobs is a good thing. I think most people would agree. But I think it's up to all of us to dig deeper, especially in this extraordinarily expensive place, this engine of innovation, the engine of the California and the U.S. economy. If we can't take care of our own people, I think it speaks to our economic system. And so, again, thank you all so much. I learned a lot from this. It does lead to legislation. It does lead to us taking action. I know that Senator Cortese and I are going to continue to do what we can to help uplift everyone. But thank you for being here, and stay in contact with our office. And by the way, if you didn't get a question answered, because we have great questions still yet that are being asked, if you have your contact info there, we'll try to get a response back to you in some form. So again, thank you all so much for being here on behalf of myself and Senator Cortese.